Hello and welcome to today's special webinar event on Veeam Research plus CTO Insights, a debrief on the 2022 Data Protection Report. Today's webinar is sponsored by Veeam and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, there are a few things that you should know about this webinar. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. We won't be doing a live Q&A session at the end, but we'll make sure to pass along all of your questions to Veeam. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. The main resource that I'd like to call your attention to is the link to download the Veeam 2022 Data Protection Report. That's the report that the experts from Veeam will be discussing during this session. So be sure to grab that report and share it with your friends and colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky attendee on the live event. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. It's an honor to introduce you to today's presenters. We have Dave Russell, who's Vice President of Enterprise Strategy, and Danny Allan, who's the Senior Vice President of Product Strategy, as well as the Chief Technology Officer for Veeam. So I'm going to turn things over to Dave to get us started.
Hi, I'm Dave Russell, Vice President of Enterprise Strategy here at Veeam Software. I'm very fortunate to be joined by our Senior Vice President of Product Strategy and our Chief Technology Officer, Danny Allan.
Thanks, Dave. I am very excited to be here. This is clearly a very exciting day to share some of the findings that we've been researching here at Veeam.
Yeah, and what we thought we would do is just unpack about a few of the many highlights that we've observed now for something called the Data Protection Trends Report. I'm going to give a little bit of color in terms of the research side of it. Danny's going to offer up some opinions based upon the many customers and industry interactions that he's had. And together, we just want to give you a good sneak peek into a research that's only published just about a couple of weeks ago. Now, if we just kind of set the stage, Danny, what is this thing? We're kind of proud of it, but what it is something now we've been doing for 3 years in a row. Last year, it was the largest ever data protection availability report in the history of the industry. We had 3,000 organizations across 28 countries participate. This year, we upped it even further, as we're prone to do at Veeam, right, Danny? We took it to another level. And we have almost 3,400 respondents. And these are predominantly from large size organizations, meaning greater than 1,000 employees. Without going too much further, you can already see the URL that you can click on to download the full report. It is free of charge. It is not Veeam specific, as we will learn, meaning no one knew that Veeam was asking these questions. We went out to the field with a third party. And now it's not a Veeam commercial by any stretch. As you will see, these are just overall industry trends. But the download's available at VEE.am/DPR22. That's just Data Protection Research Trends 22. Last several years, we've been asking a handful of these questions here around macro trends and digital transformation, infrastructure, downtime data loss, cloud protection trends. But again, we like to up the ante each and every outing. So this iteration, we focused also on containers, cyber, unfortunately, because it's almost inescapable, and business continuity, disaster recovery. So Danny, let's jump right into it. I will quickly set the stage. I'd love to get your reaction. We wanted to hit you right off the bat with a lot of data points right here. This actually, what you see, represents over 8,000 different responses over a 3-year period. But let's break this down. Let's parse this out. The question was very simple there in white. What do you estimate is your organization's percentages of the servers in each of these formats? Lower left is physical in the data center. In the middle, virtual in the data center. And then on the lower right there, it's virtual machines hosted in a hyperscaler or service provider. The reason for all these bars is we asked people going back to 2020, what are you doing today? That's on the lightish green bar on the left. And then we asked them the following year, 2021, now what are you doing today? And then we said, hey, 2 years from now, which will be that gray bar, what do you anticipate your mix will look like? And then, Danny, we repeated this question again this year, 2022, right dead in the middle. What are you doing today? And then that full right column in each of these, what do you think you're going to be doing? I've done a lot of talking. What jumped out at you when you saw this slide for the first time?
Well, two things jumped out at me for sure. One was that we have an almost perfect curve here. I look on the left and I see, 1 over x, and I look on the right and I see log x. It's basically trending down on the left, trending up on the right. And I don't think that's any mistake. What's interesting is that they are tending towards zero. In other words, as we go forward, it's not as if the physical servers are disappearing, and it's not as if the cloud is going to be 100%. The growth rates on those tend to be flattening out. And what that tells me is that it's going to be a hybrid world, and it's going to be a hybrid world for a long time to come. I tell people I started my career back on a mainframe, and that mainframe is still running today. And so while I don't expect to see a lot of physical servers in the future, I do expect that we're going to see physical servers and virtual servers and cloud servers for a very long time to come. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. While we're going to cover some data that shows the rise of the cloud, do you want to be very clear that does not mean unplug all of your kit in your data centers. It doesn't mean those racks are going to go completely to zero. In fact, I could almost argue, Danny, what we're seeing here, especially in the outline projected years, is actually a normalization. It is flattening out in terms of physical data center, virtual data center. Even if that were to change by a couple percentage points at roughly a quarter of the workloads, that's still significant.
Yeah, so we're seeing right now, what, 25%, 25%, 50%, but I expect that to normalize over time. The one thing that does jump out at me from this, Dave, is what happened in 2020 to 2021. And I think that that is probably the impact of COVID and the pandemic. It accelerated some of that movement towards cloud. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. From in some cases by intention, and in many cases, just we were forced to pivot, all of us globally. There were times when many of us literally could not get into the data center. Then when we could, and one could argue we're still in this situation today, even if you can get in the data center, even if you do have budget, that doesn't mean that you can get gear delivered right now and rack and stack it and put it to use. So if that either of those were true, you really had no other option but to explore expanding your cloud capabilities.
Yeah, and so for the organizations watching this, I guess my one takeaway for them is it's going to be a hybrid world, and it's going to be a hybrid world for a long time to come. And so as you think about um, what you need for your enterprise backup, you should be considering it in the context of a hybrid infrastructure operating environment going forward.
It's a great point. It's an and world, not an or a shift from one thing to another, or the shift is not complete. Maybe that's a good way to net it out. Let's jump in now to another data point. This one's interesting to me because many of us, if you've been in backup for a period of time and you've heard the phrase enterprise backup, it might have meant different things to different people. It might have even meant different things to yourself, depending on when and time you were thinking about this question. And again, the question in white is always up at the top. What does enterprise backup mean to you? And so what we've basically done here is said, check everything that goes into that. Those are the longer, darker green bars you see going off towards the right. And then we stack ranked this by if you could only choose one thing, what was the most important consideration? Without tipping my hand, Danny, I will tell you I was a little surprised by some of these results, but what did you observe?
Well, a few different things. Probably unsurprising to me that Cloudy popped up to the top of the list, supports modern workloads. And I expect, there's going to be a lot of that for organizations who are looking at enterprise backup and are moving to the cloud. They want some form of protection that supports those modern workloads. One of the things that jumped out at me is the number 2 item is supporting enterprise applications as opposed to down near the bottom of the list, supporting traditional data center platforms like Unix and NAS. In the past, we were always focused on infrastructure-centric protection. And one of the things that maybe didn't surprise me, but stood out for me is that we're now focused more on the workload itself than the infrastructure on which it sits. In other words, SAP HANA is more important than the Oracle or Solaris that it's sitting on. And so, what jumped out at me is we're focused more on the outcome, the workload, cloud being very important. And then as you go down the list, you'll see kind of groupings of things. There is integration across different environments. So being able to support across on-premises and the cloud, making sure that it's reliable. And then as you get to the bottom, maybe surprising to me that scale was near the bottom for enterprise backup. However, in thinking about that, my perspective is it's simply because that's expected. It's expected that an enterprise solution would protect tens of thousands of workloads.
Yeah, I want to jump in where you left off there, and that, a lot of times what we see when we ask people about the future or we ask people about what they're thinking a category means, they're really looking for things that they currently perceive to be challenges. If they think they have a multitude of scalable solutions at their disposal, or for example, tape is at the bottom of the list, not zero, want to make that point, but probably part of the thought process there is, I know I can look for an enterprise backup solution that can support physical tape. That's probably not where I'm as concerned about, can a vendor meet my needs? Conversely, jump up to the top, modern workloads around infrastructure as a service, software as a service. I might have some doubts there, but I really want to double down on what you observed, which is workloads rose to the top. It's about the protected platforms, less about the characteristics of the solution, which we jump into next in terms of like the third and the fourth response. Easy to manage across locations. It's a reliable solution. And we'll see later on, in fact, the next slide, that reliability does become a key criteria. And then you see things in the middle. And just the part where I didn't want to tip my hand prematurely is, I can remember a time when people said enterprise something. The presumption was that enterprise something must scale to handle multiple devices, large amount of data, number of concurrent transactions. But the notion that a bigger number in whichever category was of interest was somehow better, and also that constituted enterprise. No longer the key defining criteria here, is it?
No, I think most of the backup vendors in the space today can scale to those numbers simply because they have to. And so, as you say, the defining characteristic for is it really enterprise? Is associated with can they protect the workload or the outcome that I need to do at a business level?
Perfect. Well, I did mention, reliability is going to come up. Here it is. A busy looking slide, but Danny, we really love this slide now at Veeam, which we've been asking this question for 3 years in a row. Again, the question in white, very simply, what would drive your organizations to change its primary backup solution to something new? There's been a bit of a myth that no one changes backup solutions, and at Veeam, we know that's not the case. But here we ask the direct question, what are the pain points? And what you see just simply before you even look at anything in the left-hand side, meaning the categories, Danny, is look at how many people chose multiple different things, just judging from the length of the bars that go off to the right-hand side there. It's not just one sort of aggravator. And yet when we did ask what was the one thing, that's what we stack ranked this by. For the last 3 years, improving the reliability or success of backups was either number one or number two. And here we are looking at service level agreements, those acronyms, Recovery Point Objective or RPO, Recovery Time Objective or RTO. That rose to the top. But interesting, Danny, that really what we see here is I just need to make sure my solution can go protect those workloads. That's the most paramount thing. And if I can't get it, then I may need to change.
Yeah, in many ways, to me, this is an indictment of the industry that it's probably shouldn't surprise me, but the fact that people are still concerned about RPOs or RTOs tells me one of two things. Either the software solutions that organizations are using today are not meeting the requirements. And that's a shame. I mean, we're well into this period of protecting workloads. We should be, and it might be, the vendors that they're using, the software that they're using is not actually even giving them the RPOs and RTOs, giving them a metric to measure over time. But regardless of how you look at it, it tells me, and it's probably not surprising, we see this in the industry, that you have large market share donors because it's not meeting the needs of those enterprise customers.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because I agree with you. You could take a glass half empty approach is, oh my gosh, what a horrible self-assessment of the state of the industry as it currently is now and what we've seen the last couple of years. If I try to say, well, how did this happen from a glass half full perspective? The pandemic caused a great deal of change. We've already seen we didn't decommission, or at least not wholly, our on-prem servers, our on-premises applications, our entire operating systems. Simultaneously, we bursted further into the cloud. Maybe we lifted and shifted. More things are being born in the cloud. Just a long-winded way of saying one point, which is the workload is getting increasingly diversified. And it could be door number two here on what happened or what changed to cause this is that the SLAs themselves have been rising. The business or our partners, our customers expect near zero downtime with near zero data loss.
That's true. And there are other factors in here too. I know that you have often spoke of cost, complexity, and capability. And so while I'm talking about, failure sometimes to meet, you also see things like cost bubble to the top. How can I change from CapEx to OpEx, or how can I reduce my hardware and software costs? And so there are drivers on the cost side, and on the complexity side, and on the capability side, all represented in this chart. And all of this just simply represents an opportunity. And like you say, as our organizations become more complex, we said before, they're going to be hybrid. That's going to happen. Now what? Now how do we address that?
Yeah, great point. And a little myth busting down towards the bottom of the list. It used to be popular some time ago in the backup space to say, oh, well, let's get one backup solution to do absolutely everything. And I believe it's fourth from the bottom, that notion of consolidate on a single solution for backup. It certainly isn't unimportant, but from a stack ranking perspective, it wasn't going to force people to make a change, nor was just below it. Seems like just a few years ago, a lot of talk about a packaging concept around an appliance form factor. Similar notion here. It's not that it's not unimportant for a portion of the market, but it's certainly not a defining, I'm going to go rip and replace things. I'm going to retrain. I'm going to pull data again back into a new solution kind of an event, is it?
Yeah, and that's again to the complexity of the environments that we're operating in. It's not going to be a single monolithic environment. It's going to be hybrid. We're going to have some Kubernetes. We're going to have some Kubernetes on premises. We're going to have some in the cloud. We're going to have some AWS, some Azure, some Microsoft 365. We're going to have many different environments. And if you say, I only have one data protection model for that, say an appliance or a single pane of glass, often that won't meet the needs of that hybrid environment. And so that drives organizations to support that hybrid environment.
Great point. So if these are the pain points, what's the rescue? So we ask people, what do you consider to be modern or innovative from a data protection solution? Same concept, choose all that apply, those longer bars, we stack ranked by the singular one. Danny, I'm seeing a theme here of what rose to the top.
Modern approaches, right? How do I do disaster recovery via a cloud service? So probably unsurprising that we see this cloud and IaaS and SaaS and standardizing that. So I really think that we're seeing modernized data protection is really about modernized outcomes as well. And so the top categories to me, it says, do you have a solution that actually can meet the modernized requirements that I have? And then if you come down through the list, options 2 and 3, how do I integrate that into my environment? We're talking to organizations here over 1,000 employees, so enterprise by definition of Gartner at least. And they want to integrate that into the environment because that helps them to drive down the costs that they have within the environment. And then, of course, I'm always interested to see items like that ability to move workloads from one cloud to another. It tells me that organizations are not content to have a workload that only works within a single cloud. And of course, that's something that we always focus on here at Veeam. How do we be flexible to meet the needs of the organization across whatever infrastructure or cloud that they happen to be living on?
Yeah, I like the ones that you listed because there was really about 4 different cloud characteristics. The top two, the ability to move workloads there, kind of in the middle, Amazon to Azure, but one example, and the ability to move workloads from on-prem to the cloud. I really, really like response 3 and 4, which certainly care about the cloud characteristics and all of the backup characteristics. But I love that the ability to integrate within a data security strategy, the ability to embed or automate backup within systems management or other APIs. To me, that says backup and recovery is not standalone on an island, something orthogonal to the rest of the business. Backup and recovery is increasingly playing a larger role into other activities. Unfortunately, we'll see it's playing a role in cyber as well. If it's not unfortunate that backup can provide relief, but it's unfortunate that we certainly all face with that kind of problem. So speaking of problems, Danny, budget sooner or later becomes an issue. And now may not be the defining characteristic. And we did see, though, in terms of what might drive you to change, 3 of the probably the top 8 different responses did have some kind of financial tie-in. Good news, another news story on this. The good news, well, I'll give you the other news story first. So a research firm like IDC says that on average across all of IT submarkets, that this year, 2022, the budget probably will rise just under 3%. Not a huge percentage, but Danny, what jumps out right there in the box is look at the data protection budget on average that people self-report. And by people, I mean 3,400 organizations across the globe.
Yeah, increasing by 5 to 10%. And that jump to me, no, I'm making some assumptions on this, but I think that that has a lot to do with cyber and security, as you mentioned. We're seeing an explosion of ransomware. And of course, your last line of defense, your final line that you want to keep is the backup so that you can recover from ransomware. But we're also seeing this where organizations, as you said, are beginning to see the value of the data that they have and they want to use it in additional ways. And so to me, it's exciting that we're seeing organizations recognize the value of the data that they're protecting, and the budgets are rising commensurate with that. And this isn't standalone. If I'm not mistaken, I just saw a recent Gartner report for the fourth quarter of 2021 that said they were projecting a addressable market of about $10 billion, but growing over 7% for 2022. Am I right on that?
Yeah, and that $10 billion mark was software only. So independent of any kind of storage repository, server component, networking, just software licensed to enable the protection of these workloads we've been describing.
And business continuity, disaster recovery, obviously incredibly critical. We're seeing it in the global events that are happening around the world right now. Organizations are just trying to figure out, how do I keep my business up and running across these different geographies? So I'm excited to see the growth in the market, the recognition of value, but we're also just seeing from global events that it's a reality of the world in which we live.
Yeah, and speaking of Gartner, back long ago when I helped co-chair a conference back when we were in person at events. In the morning of that event, we would ask people, which was an infrastructure operations kind of data center cloud strategies event, what do you think your budget's going to look like in the next year? I will tell you, I actually look, believe it or not, on the lower right-hand side of this chart and am pleased. The lower right-hand side is who's going to decrease their budget. I just remember year after year after year for over a dozen years, we would see on average, okay, everyone's going to go up a few percentage points, maybe even a handful of percentage points. But there were always many that said that they were going to decrease. Here, if we go from the right side over to the left, just or towards the middle a little bit, 0 said my budget's going to decrease by more than 15%. Barely 0, so it didn't even round up to 1. It rounded down to 0, said my budget's going to decrease 10 to 15%. And only 1% said it's going to decrease 5 to 10. Only 2 says it's going to decrease by 5. So what does that all mean? It means that sometimes average, we can look at, if you have outliers on both ends of the spectrum, the average looks favorable, but there's a lot of people that are not enjoying a bump, I'll call it, in data protection budgets. Here, again, 3,400 people around the globe. What we expect to see across all geographies, all verticals, is a pretty healthy investment.
Yeah, it's over 85%, growing more than 5% next year. And that's probably a good thing because there is a gap, I believe, in what people expect from IT and what they're actually receiving. We actually have to close that gap as we're moving forward.
You are an incredible straight man. That is why you're SVP CTO. We've got actually this slide right here to lay that out. And I want to give a shout out to our great colleague, Jason Buffington, who's arguably not only the godfather of this research, but this specific question he's been helping to formulate and drive for a number of years. Let's just take this piece by piece, but you teed it up nicely, Danny, that there is a perceived gap. Just want to make the point again, this is organizations self-reporting. No one knew Veeam was asking it. No one, was given any kind of stack ranking. Just say, what does your organization, to the best of your ability to respond, currently face? The top, Danny, we call an availability gap. That's just simply the gap between how fast or the speed of which you could recover applications. You don't have to be too good with algebra to quickly say, wait a minute, if I add up the left two sides that strongly agree that they have a gap in kind of that turquoise color, and then the more green yellow color agree, that's 4 out of 5 say that they've got a gap of how fast they can bring data back or critical applications. Right off the bat, that sounds concerning.
Yeah, and so if you have a gap between what is expected and what they can actually achieve, that's where that 5% plus of budget increase needs to go. We need to close that gap. And I would argue this is becoming even more critical as we enter an era where regulatory pressures are going to increase, that the industries in which we live are going to say, you need to recover within a certain amount of time, or you can't afford, in the second one, the protection gap, which is how frequently are you protecting it versus how much can you afford to lose. If you live in an industry where they say you can't lose more than 5 minutes worth of data or more than 10 minutes worth of data, then you need to close that gap. And it will take some focus and expertise and budget to close that gap for the organization.
Yeah, well said. And that really leads us to the bottom half of this, which is the protection gap or the delta between how frequently you're backing up data versus how much data the organization could afford to lose. Very similar results if we just round up only but a smidgen. 4 out of 5 are self-reporting that they strongly agree that they are going to have a gap or a delta between the data that they're going to lose and versus the data they can successfully bring back. So if I put a finer point on this, it's going to take longer to get the data that we can back. And when we do, we're going to have more loss than the organization feels like they can tolerate.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you ask organizations how much can you afford to lose, the answer is usually, I can't afford to lose anything, right? Because they don't want to lose data. However, the reality is that there's a cost associated with that. And so the key for most organizations is understanding what they can tolerate, because you can't afford to protect everything. So being able to identify and prioritize and then apply the appropriate models to protect that data is what we're going to need to focus on over the next decade.
Well said. So here's a slide, a slightly different format than what we've seen, but this begins to tee up, Danny, why we might have these gaps that we just parsed through. We just are showing 2 different years of responses for, in the past 2 years, what were the most common causes of outages that your organization experienced? So the longer bars here in light green, select all the causes that might have applied. Then we asked what was the most impactful outage of 2020 and then 2021. I always just like to look at trends before we discuss specifics. Danny, my eyes drift over to the right-hand side and I see, oh my gosh, there's so many things, high 30s, low to mid upper 40s, even low into mid 50s, meaning a lot of people checked a lot of boxes for things that could take down their systems.
Yes, I mean, we're having lots of challenges still. It's funny, when I first started in the backup space, it was mostly around hardware failures. Now, the interesting thing that jumps out at me is hardware failures tends to be down towards the bottom of this list. We used to do tape backups of that mainframe because we were worried about, the storage failing or the system failing. Um, but now we have so many more things to worry about, and probably unsurprisingly, cyber leads the whole chart. Back 20 plus years ago, when we were backing up the mainframe, we weren't worried about cyber attacks. Now that's near the top. But as you say, we're seeing everything from external threats, cyber, um, internal threats. When I say internal, maybe not intentional, like deletion or the application fails. Um, or we're also seeing malicious actors down near the bottom. And so we see a wide range of things. And I expect that the number of things will increase every year and people will have checked more and more boxes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the point you raised. Human causality, whether maliciously or accidentally, represents a huge number of the most impactful, as well as the total number of things that could have caused an outage in the last 2 years. The thing that jumps out at me as we go beyond the human element to this is that it's not just one thing. If you look down, it's kind of number 3 towards the bottom of the list before you get to humans, meaning it wouldn't be that we could just get together and say, let's fix networking and our life is going to be perfect. We're not going to have an outage as long as we fend off against cyber and everything's going to be okay. It's a multitude of different areas or disciplines. And to me, this is also hearkening back to why that investment in backup might be on the rise, because not only before we get to cyber, which we will hear shortly, and the concern associated with that rightfully, but bad things still happen in the data center.
Yeah, and to put an exclamation point on that, when we're going to the cloud, we talked about modernizing, moving to the cloud. It's not as if, hardware failures or application failures disappear. These things apply to the cloud equally as they do to on-premises.
Well, that's a really good point. So just because the cloud is elastic, something fails, meaning a component fails, that's a bit like saying if you go to rent a car and the car fails, someone will run out a new automobile. But if you have a problem with your driving, your navigation, that's not going to be fixed. So your application, if it has a problem, is going to fail potentially in the cloud or on-prem. The networking and the hardware, like a server and storage, to your point, that might be but a brief hiccup of which you experience little to no discontinuity. But it doesn't mean that 100% of this goes to zero either.
Right. You know what's interesting about this? I see down near the bottom of the list, outage of public cloud resources. But if you count how many times we've had public clouds go down in the first part of this year, we might see that shift up this chart when we do this again at the end of 2022.
Wow, very interesting point. Yeah. So we've been talking about cyber, and it really seems like you can't have a conversation without getting to cyber and ransomware very, very soon. Danny, the next 2 slides are scary to me. I'm curious to get your reaction here, but here we're just asking the question, in the last year, 12 months, has your organization suffered an attack? And if so, give us a percentage or a number rather on what that looks like. What was your reaction when you saw this?
My first reaction was really 24% of customers who had no ransomware attacks. And then I realized we're asking the customers, were they aware of those ransomware attacks? And so I suspect that there's probably 24% of organizations that don't realize that they've been targeted. However, if I look on the flip side of that, 3/4 of organizations have been impacted by at least one ransomware event. And if I look out in the future, that number is not going to go down. It's only going to go up. In fact, one of the recent things that just happened, the Conti ransomware source code was leaked. And you can imagine the malicious actors getting on top of that, manipulating the code, creating new variants off of it at an even faster pace that they've been doing before. And so my takeaway from this is 3 out of 4 organizations faced at least one ransomware attack, and that's probably going to go up into the future. And I would submit to you, Dave, that 24% of organizations aren't aware but have been targeted by ransomware.
Yeah, good point on that. 1 out of 4 or 24% is a best case scenario. My eyes just drift to the shape of that curve and I say, wow, and kind of more on average here, 2 to 3 successful events in the last year is what we see right after that. People that perceive that they didn't have a problem. Maybe they did. I hope they didn't. But to your point, they well could have. They just didn't have visibility into it, or others in the organization jumped on it before it became very well known. And if you look out towards the right-hand side, while thankfully the percentages go down, 1 out of 20 had 5. That's almost every other month. 1 out of 20, almost every other month, had a quote unquote successful attack or penetration.
And it's not as if these attacks, Dave, are one day in length. As you know, here at Veeam, we have a SWAT team that is dedicated to this. And you often find that these attacks last for months and months while they're trying to clean up and bring it back to normal. So if you have 2 and 3 per year and they're lasting 1 and 2 months, that means that the majority of the time you're dealing with recovery from ransomware. And that's worries me. That's a worrying number.
Very interesting. Now, if I combine, that's a great observation. And if I combine that with things like legal hold and compliance, a few years back when a number of financial and healthcare regulations went into effect, there were reasons why we had to have holds on our backups. And what large organizations, depending on which vertical you were in, sometimes reported is exactly what you said. We are now perennially in a mode of having to address this, meaning there are no months off from ransomware. If we're one of those 2, but probably 3 attacks per year, and this is going to take many months to unwind, then every day of the year for us, we're involved with cyber remediation and trying to unwind this.
Yeah, and so the question becomes, how much are you able to recover if you're facing this continuously? What is your state of the union? What is your current state? Are you ready to recover, and can you recover all of that data?
Excellent point. And let's double click on that now. Question was simply thinking about the most significant ransomware attack in your organization in the last 12 months. What percentage of your data was your org able to recover from that attack? The average is in the middle, Danny. And while the average doesn't look that great, meaning 64% recoverable, let's flip that around. What does that actually mean?
Well, that means that 36% was not recoverable. So if I said to my wife, guess what? We're going to lose 36% of our family pictures, she would not be happy with me. The fact that organizations are aware of the fact that they can't recover this amount of data, and maybe it's the reality that they're not aware of that, but that's the whole purpose of being data driven and doing this analysis. Organizations are not able to recover significant portions of their data, and that tells me that we need better systems in place with better testing and better verification. It's shocking to me. I mean, look at that first number. Only a third of organizations were able to recover more than 80%. That is a staggering number to me. And so it just tells me we need to be doing better as an industry, not just in recovering, but in verifying ahead of time, being proactive that we can recover our data.
Well, that's a great point. There's an old saying in backup that it's very difficult to recover that which you have not backed up. And if we double clicked on that, it's very difficult to fully bring back a system if you're not sure of all the components or all the data portions that may comprise a functional business system. I always like to look at outliers. So if we look kind of at around 11 o'clock to 12 o'clock, 7%, so that doesn't sound like a big number, but that's 1 out of 14. So 1 out of 14 said we could only recover 20% or less of our data. And flipping that around, that means we lost 80% or more of our data from the last 12 months successful attack. That begins, Danny, to sound like a potentially business viability threatening kind of an attack or experience.
Yeah, it's coming close to an existential threat for a lot of organizations. I mean, we have over 400,000 customers, and you can imagine if we lost data on 50% of those, 36% of those, that would become very problematic, I would argue, for most organizations.
Yeah. So let's now go glass half full and talk about some other interesting things. Although before we transition, these hopefully somewhat disconcerting data points, the time is now to use this to your advantage. Take this data, take this research back to your business, back to your IT constituents, and say, what can we do to make sure we're not following these overall industry averages, or worse yet, being below industry average in any of this? Use this as a wake-up call, in other words. But Dane, I know you've been very, very keen on containers. What did this slide mean to you when you saw it?
I honestly, Dave, was very surprised by the numbers on this slide, and pleasantly surprised. Now, containers, as probably most people know, are a new way of delivering services. We went from, I suppose, mainframes and green screens to physical systems to virtual systems. And everyone said the next step after virtual systems was to go to the cloud, but I think of the cloud more as a consumption model as opposed to an infrastructure model, because it is, it's another virtualized work environment. But containers is a fundamentally different way of delivering services in a way that is completely elastic and enables portability. You can move from, on-prem OpenShift. We see probably about 50% of the workloads in containers in on-prem OpenShift to, into the public cloud, into AKS or EKS or GKE, these cloud Kubernetes environments. Why was I pleasantly surprised by this? Look at the numbers here. 91% of organizations are either running containers in production or planning to run containers in production, and no one was saying we're not planning to do that. Now, why was I pleasantly surprised by that? It's because people are embracing modern technology and the benefits that it brings, and I think that is incredibly important for the business continuity operations. We've struggled in traditional systems, and containers gives us an elasticity and a business continuity capability that hasn't been possible in the past. So I'm very optimistic about the fact that containers is moving forward so quickly. Of course, my caution, and the reason why we're doing this research, is because we can't forget the lessons of the past about applying security or data protection or monitoring to these new environments like containers.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And one of the reasons I really like doing this kind of research is it's always nice if you prove a thesis that you already have, but it's even more interesting if we can do a little myth busting. And there is a pretty significant contingent in the data center, particularly if you're in the infrastructure teams, the traditional backup teams, that in no way is saying the containers aren't going to happen, but that's the catch. They're believing the containers is in the future, perhaps way into the future. And what we're seeing here is the overwhelming response here is over half are in production now, and over a third that aren't in that production category at 56% plan to get so soon. And oh, by the way, the remaining less than 10% have aspirations to do so. So that is about as strong of a signal of directionally where people headed, and then from a velocity perspective, that they're going there faster than many of us may think.
And would you agree, Dave, that this is really just, again, a continuation of the theme of hybrid? Because it's not that containers are going to replace virtual machines or physical servers. It's going to be a hybrid environment, and these are going to have their use case going forward.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And, I liked what you'd mentioned a little bit about sort of the people involved. And, it's, sometimes it's popular to say, well, this will look a lot like vSphere, VMware, or if you want to broaden it out, this will have a similar trajectory and outcome as open system server virtualization. There's a part of me that appreciates that. And here's the part where I have a big disconnect from it, Danny, is that I think containers, as it relates to backup and recovery availability, fundamentally changes the landscape, because eventually we went from a server administrator might have been worried about a small vSphere implementation. Then that vSphere implementation became larger than small, and in fact, even had production applications. So they might have morphed into what eventually became a virtual administrator, But far more likely, they said, as it relates to backup, hey, traditional backup team, go take this workload. And those were the only ones that really had to think about it by and large. Containers, what we're seeing is that it very much could be the traditional backup teams need to protect a new workload, but even the DevOps teams, the application development teams are starting to recognize the need for availability as well.
Yeah, and we see this even in the N of this number here. There's a new constituent. It's not 3,400 anymore. It's the respondents to this was 1,300, and I would argue that that could be because the standard respondent may not be familiar with this. And so we're in an education market to make sure that everyone is aware of the necessity of data protection and security and monitoring and all of the things that we've learned over the last however many years it's been since IT took off.
Excellent. And so as we go to our last data point, this is specific to the cloud. And what we're asking here is what percentage of your organization's production data is protected by either on-prem backup tools or in the bottom bars there in the kind of darker green, using backup cloud services as part of that solution. Danny, again, nothing goes to zero here, but what were your observations?
Well, clearly, cloud is going to become a more major factor in data protection as we move forward. And that's a good thing. Our friend Jason Buffington likes to say, as you modernize your infrastructure, you need to modernize your data protection. And of course, we just saw workloads are moving into the cloud. We're adopting Kubernetes. And so this is an opportunity for us to make sure that we have a technology that is understanding of that next generation of infrastructure. So for example, when you go to the cloud, you're not doing snapshots on a storage array anymore. You're doing snapshots from a cloud API. When you're going to Kubernetes, you're using Kubernetes APIs. But my expectation is, again, it's not going to go towards zero, but as we adopt new infrastructures, especially as they're cloud-centric, we're going to need to have more as a service and cloudy and backup as a service type models to support those new workloads. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely would. And, just look at the acceleration that's anticipated for next year, meaning the numbers are 2020 to 2021, you could call that a pandemic spike. And then you could say, okay, 2021 to 2022, not a dramatic shift. Well, that could be because everyone kind of caught their breath. But now what people are expecting going forward is there's going to be another, and it's going to be larger than the 2020 to 2021 jump, in fact, over double, significant shift towards embracing cloud. And I just always like to make the point, it's very, very rare that for most of us that we fully decommission something. This is a shift, but it's not a shift that represents going from 0 to 100 and then vice versa. So to your point about hybrid, I think this research absolutely supports that. And as we do wind down, speaking of the research, just want to give that URL again. This is the 2022 Data Protection Trends Report. You can download it at vee.am/DPR22. And Danny, I'll give last words to you for those that might not be familiar with Veeam, because again, this research is not a Veeam commercial. It is an industry reflection, really, of what's been going on, what's anticipated in the future. But take us through a little bit about Veeam as a company.
Yeah, Veeam has been around now for 15 years, and we have over 400,000 customers. One of the things that I love to point out is it's the same technology that is installed in my basement, protecting my little system down there, my rack, as is protecting our largest financial institutions and organizations. So we serve customers from the smallest to the largest, 400,000 of them. We are present in over 180 countries. We're over $1 billion in revenue now here at Veeam, and over 1 million installations. So when people come to me and say, I have this edge case, does it work with X or Y or Z? The answer is almost certainly yes, because we have such a massive footprint, and it gives us an unfair advantage. But I really have to give a shout out. It's our customers that drive us forward to adopt these new infrastructures that give us the direction on where to lead. And that's been fantastic. It led to 27% growth last year, year over year. And I'm just excited about what the future brings. There are some trends that we're seeing now that are concerning, but I have no doubt that Veeam with our customers will be able to address all these.
Well said. Thank you very much, Danny. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Be sure to check out the Veeam Data Protection Trends Report for 2022. And again, thank you for tuning in. Have a great day.
It was a great discussion of the results from Dave and Danny. And just a reminder, if you found the data compelling and you think it might help you with things like, prioritizing, your IT, decisions, or for budget presentations with your manager or the C-suite, you can get the link to download the whole report from the handout section in your console. And before we wrap up, we do have one more piece of business. It's the $300 Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the $300 Amazon gift card is Bill Manier from Washington State. So congratulations to Bill. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I do want to thank Veeam for making this event possible and sharing all the insights that they've gathered from the report. Thanks for attending, and we'll see you at a future Actual Tech Media event.